In the becoming of one flesh, a man and a woman are experiencing a union that God Himself performs. And this is the most weighty and perhaps the most crucial of all. Verse 24, God's words of institution of marriage. God had, in making the woman, it says, taken out a rib, and He closed up the flesh. And then He made this woman and this man one flesh. From flesh to one flesh. Now, to see the magnitude of what's going on here in terms of our marriages today, we have to see the connection between Genesis 2:24 and Mark 10:8 and 9. Mark 10 is the words of Jesus, verses 8 and 9. Jesus quotes Genesis 2:24. For Jesus, this verse was the most fundamental verse about marriage in all of the Bible. This was Jesus' foundation stone for the beginning of all of His teachings about marriage. Verse 8, Mark 10. The two shall become one flesh. So, Jesus says, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. That's huge. Do you feel the weight of that? Engaged couples, married couples. When a couple speaks their vows and consummates their vows with sexual union, it is not man, woman, pastor, parent who's the main actor. God is. God joins a husband and a wife in one flesh. God does that. God does that. From which Jesus draws the awesome conclusion, what God has joined, no man may separate. The world does not know this, which is one of the reasons why marriage is treated so casually. Christians often act like they don't know it, which is one of the reasons marriage in the church is not seen as the wonder that it is. Marriage is God's doing because it is a one flesh union that God Himself performs. They shall become one flesh, therefore what God has joined in one flesh, let not man separate. So let me summarize the 4 arguments for my first head. The glory of marriage begins to be seen by taking heed to the biblical truth, the most foundational truth, namely that it is God's doing. God's doing in His design in creation as male and female. God's doing in His personally giving His daughter to the first man. God's doing in speaking the design of marriage more fully into being in verse 24, and God's doing in Himself performing the union that creates the one flesh on earth and in heaven. So, a glimpse into the magnificence of marriage from seeing it as God's doing. Marriage is from Him and through Him. And now we turn to the most ultimate thing you can say about marriage. It is to Him. It is for His glory. Marriage exists as the doing of God and as the display of God. There is no other institution like it. Nothing even comes close to this design as a display of God. His love, His Son, His covenant. Nothing comes close. Genesis 2:24, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So what kind of relationship is it? What is it? How are these two people held together? Can they walk away from this? Can they go from spouse to spouse? Is this relationship rooted in romance? Is this relationship rooted in sexual desire? Is it rooted in need for companionship? Is it rooted in cultural convenience? What is this thing called one flesh that God has created? In verse 24, the words hold fast to his wife and the words they shall become one flesh point to something far deeper and more permanent than occasional adultery or serial marriages. What these words point to is marriage as a sacred covenant, rooted in covenant commitments that stand against every storm as long as we both shall live. That's only implicit here, but it is explicit in Ephesians 5. And seeing the connection between Genesis 2:24 and Ephesians 5:31 and 32 is the most revealing thing about marriage in the Bible. So I invite you, in fact, to go with me to make the connection in Ephesians 5:31 and 32. This is Paul's letter to the Ephesians in the New Testament. He quotes Genesis 2:24, and then he says, the most glorious, the most wonderful, the most staggering thing that could possibly be said about marriage. Verse 31, Ephesians 5. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then in verse 32, he gives the all-important interpretation of those words. He says, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. In other words, when God planned man as male and female, moving from family to family into a new one flesh union, He patterned it on Christ, His Son, and His bride, the church. It didn't go the other way around. God didn't create male and female, design marriage, and then think, now, it would be illuminating for the understanding of the church if I designed